Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Library of Mistakes. If you've not been here before, we are a free public library. You can find out more about when we're open, how to come along, how to read a book, and visit the library. We're open 9 to 5, Monday to Saturday. So there's usually a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get to the meat of the evening. And the first one is that we will do another Christmas movie night. That will be on the 10th of December, and it's a movie called Trading Places. Some of you might know it's vaguely Christmassy and it's finance, and we had It's a Wonderful Life last year. I think we'll rapidly run out of Christmassy finance movies, but anyway, the Trading Places on the 10th of December. Also, after much planning, we are able to offer now something beyond just the free charitable access to the library, and there is a membership coming up. I'm told at a discounted price of only £120 a year for access whenever you want it, unlimited tea and coffee, ability to borrow books, discounts, and if you subscribe to that, obviously you'll be supporting the charitable work of the library. That is, I think, enough of the announcements. Now I get to introduce our guest speaker, senior lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast, Philip Fliers, not a fellow Belfast man, though he will sound like he's a fellow Belfast man. He's actually from the...
I do not sound like I'm from Belfast. Just to make that clear.
And I will ask everybody at the end, Philip, he's actually originally from the Netherlands, and a really interesting man because he began life as an economist, and then as an economist realized that to understand economics, he would need to understand economic and financial history, and is now part of Queen's University Belfast Management School, which is a fantastic place because it's full of financial historians at the management school, not at the history school, but at the management school. I think it's a tremendous thing that's happening there. Many of your colleagues have been and kindly spoken for us in the past. So it's a hell of a title you've chosen.
Yes.
So, Philip,
provocative as ever.
Press the button and over to you.
So thank you very much, Russell. Very kind introduction. So I'll try and avoid saying anything offensive or very problematic. So yes, I'm a financial historian, economist by trade, and what I do is look at the past to learn the lessons that we need for our future. So today we're going to be talking about the financing of fascism and see if we can draw some lessons from our history. So I want to take you back to October 1922. Italy is restless. Coming out of the First World War, things aren't looking great. Inflation is spiking. Prices of household goods, of food, going through the roof. Unemployment skyrocketing. There's unrest in the street. And by the end of October, people from all cities across Italy are marching towards Rome. The king doesn't want to quash the unrest, and decides to invite the protesters' leaders to form a new government. This is the government of Benito Mussolini. And this is how the fascists came to power. Over the next couple of years, Mussolini would consolidate his power on a promise of restoring Italian greatness as a global power, bridging the class divides that had been created over the early decades of the 20th century. He made a lot of promises. Did he actually deliver? And how did he pay for this? Right? It's one of the questions that we're going to answer today. Then fast forward 18 years to May 1940, right? The Nazis invade the Netherlands. After a short campaign of only 5 days, the Dutch surrender, and with their government in exile, Hitler appoints 2 Austrians, Seyss Inquart and Hans Fischbroek, to run the Dutch government. Within 2 years, the two Austrians and the civil government that's been installed introduced 12 new taxes and set up a bureaucracy that massively expropriated Dutch citizens and Dutch businesses. Right? And I'm going to explain to you today how they financed their fascist and Nazi ideology. Right? And this is especially important, right? We know all the atrocities that the Nazis and that the fascists committed in the 20th century, but no one talks about how they paid for it. Right? Where did the money come from? Yeah? What shenanigans did they pull? How did they expropriate their citizens out of their well-earned money? How did they do this? Yeah? So if I would tell you, point me to Hitler or point me to Mussolini, you can all identify the iconic pictures, right? But you have no idea who these people are, right? These are the ministers of finance that designed the policies that made it financially possible for Italy to begin its grand works, to come up with the money to resource the amazing buildings that you now see throughout Italy. More than 40 bridges were built, more than 4,000 kilometers of road infrastructure was built under the fascist government. Stefani was massively instrumental in designing new tax policies for the fascists. Volpi was crucial in restoring the link between the Italian currency, the lira, with the British pound, right? So every one of these people played a crucial role in financing fascism. Hans Fischbroek, the Minister of Finance under the Nazi occupation in the Netherlands, right, he designed a massive bureaucracy to extract as much value from the Dutch economy as possible. Yeah. So understanding what these people did is of vital importance if we want to understand where the finance for fascism came from. So what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you two stories, right? I'm going to tell you about the great works that the Italians undertook, the objectives that they had. So you might recognize the palace of Italian civilization. And on the other hand, we have the building of the Dutch Stock Exchange. So the Dutch story is going to be all about how did the Nazis tax Dutch corporations? How did they use Dutch businesses to support the Third Reich? We're going to start off with Italy. So Mussolini's government came to power with a problem, with the promise of restoring unity across the country, making sure that the country became self-sufficient, and supporting big business, right? Did the country become self-sufficient, right? Were they able to provide in their own production? Not really, right? By the end of the period, by 1939, right, wheat and food prices skyrocketed by about 33%, right? So wasn't very successful, mind you, yeah? But all these policies, all these great works, all these infrastructure investments, right, they needed to be paid for in some way. By 1935, right, the Italians also started their rearmament. And we all know, right? Investing in your military isn't necessarily value creating, at least in terms of monetary returns, right? So they created a very complicated set of policies and accounts and created a fiscal illusion, right? They promised to restore the deficits, right? So the government would no longer be running a deficit, but that actually didn't work out that well. But crucial in all of this is propaganda, right? Because you can only create a fiscal illusion, right, if there is some form of trust that your society still has. Now, trust is very difficult, especially if you remember that by the time that the fascists came to power, right, inflation was at an all-time high. So this is the consumer price index that sort of spurred the unrest in Italy at the time. And here you on the right-hand side, you see people marching towards Rome. Yeah. So we're at the start of fascism rule in Italy. So what did the Minister of Finance do to sort of appease their base, if you will, right? You start tinkering with the taxes, right? That's the first thing the Minister of Finance did. Yeah? And the first choice, and some of you might recognize this from what's going on now, is let's tinker with the capital levy. So if you're investing your money, right, you're going to have to pay taxes over this. Yeah? So in the media, everywhere, they were saying, oh, we're taxing the capital owners. Right? You own a big plot of land, we're going to be taxing it. Yeah? That's what they said in the media. In reality, they actually turned back the taxes on capital ownership. And all of a sudden, you no longer had to register your securities that you owned. Because the government, after the First World War, was very quick to say, if you have profited from the war, you need to be taxed over that. Yeah? The fascist government immediately abolished that. But they said they didn't. Yeah? Because they needed to be seen as if they were bridging the class divide. Yeah? But that was very problematic because actually the capital levy isn't that important in terms of government revenue, right? So no one actually cares. It's economically unimportant. So what do? You come up with an indirect tax, right? Sales taxes. Yeah? But what do you need for sales taxes? You need a good bureaucracy to actually collect that tax money, right? So also very ineffective. Even though they tried to sell it off as if it was, right? And they pretended, look, our sales tax is actually taxing the people that spend a lot of money, right? But we all know, right, and some of you are economists, sales taxes or value-added taxes, they're actually regressive, right? So, again, it sounds nice in the newspapers, but very, very ineffective in reality. What's the other policy that they put in place, the other tax that they put in place? They were like, let's get to working on inheritance taxes, right? So how do you pretend to bridge the class divide? By putting in place a massive inheritance tax, right? Massive confiscation of property going all the way up to 75% and more. Right? You stand to inherit a piece of land, you pay 75% tax over it. So the idea was here to encourage saving, to do justice to the South, and bridge the class. They even went as far after these forms of taxes to tax state monopolies. Also very economically unimportant, right? That's at most 2% of the government's revenue, right? They even taxed coffee production. Yeah, exactly. Why Italy, right? And how did they sell this? They sold all of this as being very positive. In the newspapers, you had the industrial revival of Italy's economy, right? Decreasing unemployment. And then there were lines like, because of our amazing tax system, we have now been able to revitalize the Italian industry. It was all bollocks, right? Because if you're able to see this, right, who owned the newspaper, right? Benito Mussolini, yeah? So if you think about it, right, every tax change that was made during this period, it was pure propaganda, yeah? Pure propaganda. Italy had one of the most concentrated media landscapes in Europe by the time that the fascists came to power. By 1933, Germany had copied the same model, right? And it's not just me that says these taxes were completely ineffective. No, one of the contemporary tax specialists also points out that the tax system has been changed so that it's somewhat less burdensome to the well-to-do, right? So the people that were already well off, they actually paid less taxes by 1925. And if you want some more tangible statistics, the tax burden actually went down from about 27% to 21%, right? So if it isn't taxes, right, that financed fascism, right, even though the Italians made it look like they did, yeah, it's got to be debt, right? So over this period, 1922 to 1939, 34 roughly, right, debt increased by 50%. The government debt increased by 50%. If you correct for inflation, it's actually 80%. Yeah? So that's not very great. But if you look at the media, the news reports, right, especially in the early days, right, around 1925, right, the government was claiming, but look, our debt is going down, our deficits are reducing. Well, first of all, that was because of the policies of the previous government, right? So you're claiming successes that aren't actually yours. And, right, what you see here is that the debt goes down after 1924. Guess why that is? In 1925, they got a massive debt relief from the US and the UK. They didn't have to pay back their debts from World War I, right? So the UK gave them they took a haircut of about 82%. The US took a haircut of 86%, right? Well, that gives you a lot of money to then all of a sudden invest in your ideological commitments, right? So that's the first point. The second point, in 1926, Italy links its currency to the British pound. And then in 1934, there was a massive default. And I'll talk about that in a second. Well, actually now, right? So what happens in this default, right? They're big, long maturity, 15 to 20 year debt. They said, well, anyone who's invested in our bonds, right? Your bonds are now, their capital value is now reduced by 30%, and the 5% interest that you're getting on this, yeah, we're just going to reduce that to 3.5%, right? All of a sudden, you've got, like they would say in the UK, you've got a lot of headroom to, you know, to do something about it. Then there's redeemable debt as well. But a lot of the long-term debt that in 1934 was basically defaulted on, right? Because this, you can sell it as, everyone's doing their moral duty for Italy's unity, right? And everyone needs to sacrifice. But internationally, this is seen as a default, right? The other part of the 30%, they transferred into a form of redeemable debt, where the government can just decide themselves how and when they're going to pay back this debt, right? So the actual ex ante agreed on maturity no longer matters, right? So the government massively increased their redeemable debt with the provision, we'll see whenever we start paying back the principal. Why was all of this necessary, right, this massive default? Well, in 1926, whenever the Italians had linked their currency back to the British pound, they also pulled another trick, right? They said, well, all of our short-term debt that we now have, we're going to convert that into long-term debt. So we're not actually going to pay back any of our short-term debt anytime soon. Right? So what happens? Capital markets lose all their confidence in you if you say that, right? You are never going to get access to any short-term credit anymore, right? So that prompted, so all those years later, the default to reduce the interest required to pay on the long-term debt. Then there is the debt the state has to pay in annuities to corporations, right? So this is the debt that they held through state ownership or state-linked enterprises. Yeah? That skyrocketed in 1932 because that's whenever they started to rebuild the country or start their great works. And it's basically a build now, pay later scheme, right? Yeah, you start construction on that and maybe we'll start paying you in 30 years, right? By 1939, the maturity on the debt in this category had risen to about 39 years, yeah? So that is a kind of problematic, I would say. Right? So if you add all of these sort of debt shenanigans together, what do you get? Well, you get problematic debt to the tune of 66 billion lire at this time. Right? So the Great Conversion, i.e., the biggest default, is actually only 28% of that. The conversion I just talked about, if you do the math, it's about 23% of that 66 billion. big chunk is actually the state annuities. So the debt that the Italian government holds through state-linked enterprises. So this gives you a hint, right, how important the Italian businesses were in financing fascism. Yeah? And this is where Italy was very innovative, right? They created two institutions, IMI, who was basically responsible for financing all credit used in the Italian fascist era, but this was a very long-lasting institution. So they were responsible to finance all relatively short-term credit, but everything was state-backed. But because it was state-backed, it didn't appear on the government's balance sheet, right? So actually, right? So this is like your modern version of off-balance sheet liabilities, yeah? And we all know how that works out, right? And then there's the IRI, that is basically a new type of institution at this time, unique to Italy and never seen before in Europe. That was designed during the Great Depression, after the crash of 1929, to basically bail out state banks, savings banks, and to acquire industrial interests that would have otherwise gone bankrupt, right? So this became a massive holding company of all kinds of businesses throughout the Italian economy, and providing a long-term debt to this, to the economy. And all of these two institutions together basically put the entire banking sector and other financial institutions on a sort of, they became irrelevant. Yeah? So the Bank of Italy and the major commercial banks, the only role that they now had was to discount short-term government debt. Right? They were completely marginalized. So Henry Miller wrote an essay on the monetary and economic situation of Italy in 1940. The Italian banker has lost all autonomous action and all initiative within the economic picture. He carries out a simple routine of discounting money. Right? So effective, well, by 1925, yes, Italy's deficit was eliminated, but this was only very short-lived, right? By 1933, right, deficits had already become persistently present again, right? Italy has always had a problem running a surplus. Did inflation actually go down? Yes, at some point after 1926, whenever Italy joined the gold standard, deflation did happen, but it never went back to a pre-war or even pre-fascist levels, right? Unemployment, sky high. It only started to come down after 1934, 1935. Why is that? Rearmament, right? We're just going to employ everyone in the military, right? So not very successful. Salvemini, who wrote an essay about this, Mussolini has tried not so much to raise the Italian man to a higher level of civilized life, but it's all about dazzling them with their spectacular fascist achievements, which actually weren't there. Yeah? So in Italy, financing fascism was all about instilling trust with the public that they're trying to eliminate the class divide with ineffective taxes, right? So it's all about debt, borrowing, and defaulting on your obligations that you actually have, but being able to sell them properly through a bureaucracy of a state-controlled economy, right? Because remember, IMI and the IRI, right? State-controlled companies that basically control the entire economy. Okay, fast forward 18 years, the Netherlands, a occupied country under Nazi rule, right? This became, under the civil government, became a command economy. And the civil administration, headed by Sijs Inquart and Hans Fischbroek, erected a command economy, a bureaucracy to force compliance, which is very easy because the Netherlands has a very similar legal structure to Germany, right? And what they did is they used taxes and forced collaboration to extract as much money to finance their horrible ideology, right? So the civil administration had two objectives: roll out the Nazi ideology, right, and to integrate the Dutch economy, right, with that of Germany, right, and to use the Dutch economic power to the benefit of the Nazi regime. And spectacularly so, right, the civil administration did a really good job of preserving Dutch productivity. So only by 1944 and 1945 was there any hint that the Dutch economy was sort of suffering. But the Dutch kept up their productivity for a very long time. Employment actually rose during the occupation, right? So Dutch businesses were kept intact and operational throughout. And one of the ways in which they did this, right, the Germans protected their interest by putting in place sort of caretakers at crucial companies, right? They had a very special, complicated name. I'll not botch the pronunciation, but these caretakers would basically make sure that the directors and supervisory directors of all these companies would comply with German rules, right? And with all the decrees that the government would be issuing. Another way through which they took control and expropriated the Netherlands was through labor, right? So the Dutch already had a long history of advertising for Dutch people to go and work abroad, right? And the first image on the left, I'll not fully translate it for you, but it's basically an advertisement to go and work abroad from the 1930s. So across the Netherlands, there were these labor offices where you could go and register to go and work in another country, to go and work in Belgium, to go and work in Germany. And the Germans used this infrastructure to put people to work in Germany. And that's a very cheap way of getting access to labor supply, right? And that infrastructure was already present. Another way of extracting resources and equivalently money was by collecting metal, right? So here you see an image of a brigade of soldiers with traditional Dutch bikes, right? These bikes, they're all made of metal, right? So the Dutch were stimulated or encouraged, right, to hand in their bikes. You get pennies on the dollar, basically, for your metal. That metal was then shipped through the river network to Germany, so that new weapons could be manufactured from this, right? Very cheap resource extraction, right? And then we have Fliers. So this gentleman over here, he was in charge of one of the most extractive institutions that you can think of, right? So this is the company, this is the individual that set up the government institution. Sort of the closest analogy that I can give you is the Office for National Procurement, right? So what he would do is issue orders based on what his superiors in Germany would need in terms of industrial production, and then he would find companies in the Netherlands to produce these materials. So some of the big household names of this time, household companies like brands that everyone would know, right, would be working for the Germans, right? And even though a lot of Dutch companies also massively resisted working for the Germans, roughly 40% got paid by the institution that was headed by Fliers on the right here. So there's a massive extractive institution, and some companies over the span of the war period got paid as much as 14 million guilders at the time, which is roughly 110 million euros in today's value, right? So that is a lot of money, right, for one individual company. I'm not going to give you the name of the company. Can't do that. And just to illustrate, so I don't expect you to remember everything that's on here. Yeah? But this is the schematic overview one of my colleagues made a few years ago of what the Dutch economy under the command of the Nazis looked like, right? Everything up there is all the German side of things, and then all of those lines going and controlling Dutch companies, right? So there was no escaping German influence, right? Everyone was supporting this to some extent. So another way that, you know, the Germans extracted a lot of money was through taxes. By 1942, the Germans had introduced 15 new taxes. The most invasive is actually the profit tax, right? Up to 55% of corporate profits was taxed away. Whenever this was announced in the newspapers and the official legislation came out, right? And we did a very rough calculation on this. Dutch shareholders lost out to the tune of 5% of the country's GDP, right? This is a massively extractive policy that they put in place. And I don't think I've ever seen a bigger tax announcement than this. So, you know, the budget from was it today, right? It could be so much worse, right? The consequence of this, however, was that the Dutch corporations were able to borrow a lot more. So the dashed line are sort of the companies that, because interest can be deducted from your profit bill, hey, all of a sudden you can borrow a lot more money, right? And that massively helped with the rebuilding after the war, because they had so much money on their balance sheet, right? Ta-da, we'll just use that to pay for the reconstruction. So in the Netherlands, it was all about fiscal extraction through the existing legal framework and the forced collaboration, right? It wasn't so much, the fascist and Nazi policies weren't so much funded by debt as it was in Italy. No, it was all about taxes and the existing bureaucracy. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you. Why don't you see? So we met earlier this year at the Economic History Society conference, and I used my plenary lecture to request economic historians from around the world to come speak at the Library of Mistakes. And you're the only volunteer, so thank you.
I think Owen also volunteered.
I'm sorry, Owen. Yeah, absolutely right. And but the reason I say that is I'm sure lots of your colleagues are watching, so that's an open invitation. Please get in touch. I want to speak about Italy and the corporations in Italy and the savers in Italy and how that all works. So there's a lot of savers getting pillaged here. So we've got two types of savers: savers who are on bank deposits, savers who are in, let's say, investment products. How did the control take place? It's always how the Nazis do that. They invade the country. But Mussolini has to do that. Is that via regulation? Is it by simply just kicking people out and putting his appointees in to run insurance companies and banks? So that bit, the bankers lost all control. Explain to us how they lose control.
So the losing of control, it sort of happens organically, right? Because 1929 comes around, right? Stock markets crash, these banks get into trouble, right? The state comes in and rescues them, right? This is how the IRA and IMI get formed, and these banks all of a sudden are under state control, right? And they get assigned a specific job. And anyone who loses out, right, sorry, you're just contributing to Italian power, to unity. This is the sacrifice that we have to make for greatness. So there's a lot of, they were enabled to do this, to seize control because of the economic situation, but they were then also able to sell it really well, and sort of prevent.
So I get that in the banks. They're highly geared institutions. There's a depression. They need a bailout. Yeah. Italy's famous for having some really high-quality companies in the north, industrial companies. How did they fall under the control, or did they fall under the control of Mussolini? Or beyond the banking system, how else was control exerted?
So this was largely policy, industrial policy, right? So Mussolini's objective was price control, wage control, right? So there were rules in place, and so this is one of the ways in which the IRI gets really big, right? Essentially, IRI became a tool to control crucial industries, right? So the bigger the industry, the bigger the control of IRI in that industry, simply by acquisitioning and nationalizing these important companies and enforcing. And one of the things that I should mention here is that industrialists agreed with this to a large extent, right? Because what did they fear most, and maybe I should have said this during the talk, what did they fear the most is that the communists were taking over the factory floors, right? This is also one of the reasons why the US and the UK were willing to take those haircuts during the early years, sort of haircuts that I showed on the where the debt declined, right? Because everyone saw that they needed to oppose the rise of the communists, right? So the UK and the US also supported the fascists to look, because they could be a counterbalance to the rise of the communists in Europe.
So if your regulator sets your prices and your wage price, it's got a great control over corporate profits. So what was allowed in terms of corporate profits under Mussolini? I mean, was he feeding lots of people who were supporting him? Was he manipulating corporate profits, or he was just simply taking corporate profits to fund the state? What was that relationship like?
So I don't see any evidence of sort of profit manipulation in any of the research that I have done into this. But I also didn't go into all the financial accounts of all the underlying Italian companies. On the second part, no, it's all about the debt. I don't think it's about profit manipulation or profit extraction. It's where are we able to make the investments and borrow the money. I don't see well, I'll leave that to other financial historians to figure out.
So the saver's losing a lot of money in all of this process. I just assume you can't protest that. It's just too dangerous to protest the fact that your savings are being stolen. So stealing savings isn't difficult if it's actually dangerous for savers to protest.
So especially in the first period, I don't think there's a whole lot of violence associated with that, but especially when we go towards the rearmament period, yes, obviously that becomes a problem, but that process had already completed by then, right? The militarization, the rearmament was to address other problems at that point, yeah.
Final question for me. I don't think everybody here will know what a capital levy is. I think we're familiar with a wealth tax, but a capital levy comes to Italy after World War I, comes to Japan after World War II. So it wasn't Mussolini, it was before Mussolini, but perhaps you could tell us what a capital levy is.
So basically any form of capital that you would have can then be taxed by the government. In Italy, this was primarily concentrated on land ownership and securities or shares that you would own.
And this is a one-off tax, or it's an annual tax?
Annual tax.
Annual tax.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll
Any idea how much that was? What sort of percentage of the wealth of owners of capital was taken off them?
I don't know.
Yeah. And the Japanese did it as well. But the argument is that these people have made money through ill-gotten gains, and therefore...
Yes, during the First World War. And so one of the reasons why this is very difficult to figure out for Italy is because Italy had two sets of accounts, right? So, yeah, you shouldn't be surprised about this, right? One set of account about how things legally took place, and one set of accounts on how they actually took place. And that makes it very difficult for us financial historians to sort of figure out what are the associated percentages. And so there's a lot of hand waving that a lot of us do when it comes to Italian public finance.
There's a great bit in Catch-22 where the young bombardier is talking to the guy who runs the brothel.
Yeah.
And he explains that he's here to win the war. And the Italian guy says, well, why don't you want to lose the war? Because if you lose the war, you get to default on all your liabilities.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is these guys won the war. They were on the winning side of World War I, and they still defaulted on their liabilities. So just because you happen to be on the winning side doesn't mean at all that you're going to live up to your liabilities. And of course, the British inflated away their debts and defaulted on their liabilities in a slightly less dramatic way.
So I guess the lesson is just don't borrow that much. But maybe that's, I shouldn't be saying that in the UK.
Well, I think you set that question up quite nicely. So we'll now go to you, Anna. Who's got any questions for Philip? Just wait for the microphone. So this is.
Sorry, the situation in Italy, was this a pre-arranged plan by the fascists, or did they just fall into it as they went along?
That's a great question. So, I don't have sort of any academic research to sort of back this up, so I'm going to give you my opinion on this. The way I read this is that, okay, we're going to try taxes. That clearly doesn't work. We'll try this, right? So I'm going to go with they sort of fell into it, but it also didn't work, right? So delivering on the promise of the great work and restoring Italy's power, creating a national unity, encouraging saving, that was the plan. The outcomes were the plan. How to get there, I haven't seen any evidence of, you know, in 1922, Mussolini had this amazing pathway towards prosperity type plan.
It's a little bit like whack-a-mole, was it? Just running after the money where they could get it.
But hey, if you can end up controlling the entire economy through these state-linked institutions, yeah, as long as you can park your debt away somewhere. Does that answer your question?
Not really.
Well, I can maybe ask a totally different question. My name's Anne Ferguson, and thank you, Dr. Fliers. What a contrast between the two countries.
Yeah.
I'm quite sure you also follow the current news. Tell me what parallels you see with Putin and Italy. Because Putin has control of his people, and they seem to be accepting the line that's delivered, but he's an autocrat and he's plundering, and the people don't know.
I'm glad Anne said Putin there. I thought she was going to say something else.
So I'm going to have to be very careful here, because I don't want Russell to get sued or anything. I don't think there are very clear parallels to fascist Italy, but I think in terms of policies, is there, also sort of relating to the earlier question, is there a clear plan as to, okay, what do we do with the debt now that we've racked up so much of it? How are we actually going to get it down? Are we going to cut our spending, or are we taxing more, or are we just going to shift boundaries? We were talking about this earlier. I don't want to make any sort of parallels between a fascist government and what the UK is currently doing. That I think that's a bridge too far. But I think in terms of thinking about how much debt, how much, if you want to call it headroom, can you actually have, Britain needs to be very careful.
Has any political party anywhere in the world consulted you on any of this?
No.
Good.
Do I want them to? Probably not.
Good. I was hoping that would be the answer.
So, can I ask you two questions? The first one is, Britain defaults on its war loan in 1932, and does that give the Italians some ideas? And also could that be an idea for today? But then the second question, whenever I'm teaching about Italy, they always have a real problem borrowing long term until they join the euro. So is this a legacy of all these defaults in the 30s?
Philip, you better explain the form of that default that Britain does in 32.
So I'm not. So well, you might be better placed to.
Well, basically,
to
they get enough people to agree to a cut in the coupon. Basically.
Yes.
I mean, there's more to it than that, but we'll stick with that.
So in Britain, it's a simple coupon default. In Italy, the 30. So Italy is constantly looking at the UK. So whenever they link their currency back to the pound in 1926, right? They set it at a very ambitious level because, you know, they want to be seen as that great, and sort of, we're on par with the British in terms of economic power, which they're obviously not, but they're just doing this for the sake of pride, right? So they put the link to sterling at a much too high level. They see the default happening in 1932, right? Yes, that inspires the 1934 default and the associated coupon conversion, the 30% overall haircut. And you're absolutely right. This is the period where the institutions are formed that would cause Italy to have historically a tradition of high debt levels, right? Coming out of World War I and then transitioning into this fascist era, that's where the root of this period and long persistent history of the high debt levels is absolutely.
There's an interesting contrast in Italy because private sector debt is really low. It's better than Germany relative to GDP. And you've got these two conflicting things. You've got a government over here and a private sector, which is, I mean, conservative is the right word, I think, for the household and corporate sector of Italy's balance sheet. But the government is running amok somewhere else. That seems to be a long-term situation.
Yeah, I think that's also partly to do with some of the waves of privatization that's gone on, and people sort of realized, okay, maybe we shouldn't mirror the excessive debt policies that the government, you know, firms need to keep some debt capacity, right? The way you fund your business, right, the amount of debt that you carry, that absorbs the shocks in terms of you know, whenever there's a negative, think of a Brexit or a Great Depression or whatever, right? Your business needs to survive, and you need some debt capacity to absorb those negative
And these are
shocks.
family companies, really. They're run by families. They're not sort of run by institutional investors.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is there a capital levy in the Netherlands after World War II, or does everybody, all these corporates get to keep all this money, do they?
No. So this is a very good question. So the extremely extractive taxes that I talked about for the Netherlands, the moment the Dutch get liberated, what happens is that the government in exile comes back, and the first thing they say, remember those taxes the Nazis put in place? We're actually going to keep that, right? Because somehow the country needs to be restored, right? And this is also how the new government after the war also paid for this.
Okay. Philip, thank you. Ladies
You're
and gentlemen,
welcome.
Philip Fliers.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. As ever, drinks are provided by Kennox Asset Management. I hope you'll join us for the drinks. We have lots of glasses and bottles on the floor. Please pick them up and take them to the back, or there will be an accident. We have another event next week, the history of US bank regulation. Let's see if we can get 80 people in the room for that. I have read the book. It's incredibly interesting, actually, and of course, you know, incredibly important. So I'd be delighted if you could join us for that next week. Don't forget film night coming up, and that'll be enough for this year. That'll take us to 28 events for the year. And please join us for a drink. And once again, please thank Philip.
And thank you all for coming as well.
We need to